Aloha. My name is Jellinek. I'm executive director of this Hawaii Book and Music Festival. This is the last day of the festival, which has been running the whole month of October. It's almost all been on Zoom. Next year, we hope to be in person. We have a special program entirely dedicated to memoir, memoir writing, memoir reading. We just had a wonderful conversation between Craig Howes and Tom Kauser on the general definitions of memoir, the evolution of memoir. Tom Kauser is the author of a book I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in writing a memoir, but probably most of the panel we have here today is no longer interested in writing a memoir. But it's a wonderful book called Memoir, an Introduction. And this will be followed by a very practical panel run by Darian G on the writing, editing, publishing, and promotion of your memoir. But the idea of this particular panel was to show how extraordinarily different memoirs can be. And in fact, I can hardly imagine a more different set of memoirs than we have represented here. I'm going to just read you their biographies. These are the same bios that appeared on our website. First up will be Vicky Durand. She graduated from Punahou High School, spent her formative years in Hawaii as a young surfer, winning in 1957 the Makaha International Surfing Championship. Wave Woman is her first book, and it's a biography of her mother, a Renaissance woman who believed in trying anything exciting at least once, including surfing. Vicky's mother, Betty, was a pioneering female big wave surfer and one of two women on the Hawaiian surfing team to compete in Lima in 1957. Vicky received her BS at California State University in Long Beach and an MS from Oregon State University. Her book is labeled a biography, but to my mind, it's almost as much a memoir because she has a lot of herself in it. And I should add that I believe it's being made into a movie, which is a remarkable fact in itself. The second memoirist we have is Rajiv Mohabir. He's the author of 3 collections of poetry, including Cultish, which was awarded the Eric Hoffer Medal Provocateur, long listed for the 2022 Penn Volker Prize, and was a finalist for the National Book Critics of Book Award. His memoir, Anti-Man, won the Forward Indies Award for LGBTQ and nonfiction, and was a finalist for the 2022 PEN America Open Book Award, the 2021 Randy Schultz Award for Gay Nonfiction, and 2021 Lambda Literary Award for Gay Memoir Biography. As a translator, his version of I Even Regret Night, Holy Songs of Demerara, won the Harold Morton Landon Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets in 2020. He teaches in the MFA program at Emerson College and lives in the Boston area. John Walters, known as Walter Boy, grew up on sugar plantations on the Big Island of Hawaii. John graduated from Ka'u High School and earned a Master of Social Work degree from UH Hawaii. He retired after 25 years with the state of Hawaii. He has also worked as a supermarket manager, a beer salesman, and deckhand on an inter-island tugboat. John lives on the island of Oahu, where he enjoys spending time with his granddaughter and her family. He also enjoys diving for taco off Oahu's South Shore. In his youth, he competed 4 marathons and completed the Waikiki rough water swim. Sydney laukea is a native Hawaiian educator who holds a PhD in political science with an emphasis in Hawaii politics. Sydney was the Hawaiian Studies Program Manager for the Department of Education and currently works at Kamehameha Schools Hawaii as a senior design specialist. She's the author of The Queen and I, a story of dispossessions and reconnections in Hawaii, University of California Press, which won a Kapalapala Okela Excellence in Publishing Award. The second book is Keka'a, The Making and Saving of North Beach, West Maui. She is also the author of a TED Ed animation, The Dark History of the Overthrow of Hawaii. Finally, it's Don Wallace. Don Wallace edits the Hawaii Review of Books, otherwise known as THROB, is contributing editor at Honolulu Magazine, received the Loretta Petrie Award for Outstanding Service to Hawaiian Literature in 2021, and is the author of Hot Water Fiction, One Great Game Nonfiction, and The French House, a memoir. A Tide in Time, the log of Matthew Roving, a time travel YA serial set during the American Revolution, ran for 3 years in Naval History magazine. So how's that for some contrast? So let's start with Vicky Durand. Vicky, the questions I set for all of you were, what was your vision of the memoir when you started? How different was the outcome? How did you go about planning, researching, and writing it? Did you encounter particular problems? And what would you do differently? So over to you, Vicky.
All right, Roger. Thank you for including me in this very recognized panel. So Wave Woman, I had an amazing mother who was so many things. She was a dental hygienist very early, a jeweler, a fisherwoman, a philosopher, and just an amazing mother who wanted to try anything exciting at least once. So she was like my best friend. And after she passed, she had actually written haiku late in life when she had lost her vision to macular degeneration. And so she had put her haiku into a book, which I wrote the introduction for. And about 5 years after she passed, I knew that something better, more in depth had to be written about her. So that was my goal. And I was not a writer. I was a clothing designer and a teacher and some other things. So it was quite a challenge. The second question is how did I go about it? So I really, we served at an amazing time when there were only about 2,000 people surfing on Oahu. And she told me, she was very insightful. And she said, Vicky, this sport is really going to be big and you should keep notes because someday you might want to write about it. And I said, no, mother, I'm too busy living the sport. You take the notes. Well, to make a long story short, neither one of us took the notes. And then 60 years later, when I decided that I had to write this book, I first of all went back through all of the pictures and I had them, I bought a printer and got a friend to help me. And I thought I'd tell the story with pictures, a lot of with pictures. And so that, when I got to my third editor, Connie Hale, said, and I sent her this manuscript with all these pictures neatly tucked in. And she said, Vicky, take those pictures out right now. We're not telling the story with pictures. We're telling them with words. So that was, okay. So I learned how to write scenes and proceeded in to tell the story with words. And the further I got into it, I also found about a year and a half after writing a old cardboard box in our dusty garage at Makaha, which was a biography, not a biography, sort of a memoir that my mother wrote at 24. And it had writings and poetry that she'd kept her whole life. She lived to be 98 and a half. And also just a lot of hints to help me write the story, but it was difficult because I hadn't asked enough questions. So that was a difficult thing. But as I got into it, it kind of all worked out. And what would I do differently? I would have asked more questions while she was alive.
Can you describe the form you used, the way you shaped it?
I just started writing from the beginning of her life. She was the granddaughter of Mormon recruits by Brigham Young into Salt Lake City. And this became a big problem because she didn't get to Hawaii and start to surfing until she was 41. So that was probably one of the biggest challenges, how to start the book with the most interesting part, which was getting to Hawaii and having that first surf lesson, falling in love with surfing and Hawaii. And so that was my biggest challenge. And it was a big challenge for my editor also, but we finally figured it out.
And if you were to do it again, would you write it exactly the same way?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes, because it came out. I wanted a book that really told her story and inspired other women and men. And I think it came out really much more influential than I ever dreamed possible. So I'm very happy with it. And there hasn't been a movie. I'm hoping for a TV series or a movie, but I'm over on Maui right now. I was invited to Wailea a couple of days ago to talk to a women's group about her life and her struggles. So it's really made my life a lot richer, and I'm thrilled at the reception.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Couldn't be happier.
That's fabulous. Okay, let's go on to Rajiv. Rajiv, same questions, but in whatever order you would like to answer.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for sharing these questions with me, Roger. It's so wonderful to be here with you all. Thank you for asking me to be on this panel. I'm just going to pull up my slides really quickly so that I can share my screen with you all this afternoon. Hopefully you can see me. Yes. Okay, here we go. So basically, I have been thinking about that question that you asked, like, what was my vision when writing this memoir when I first started? And for me, the memoir, this is the the cover right here. Everything is kind of like in mirrors, so excuse me if I'm a little awkward here. It's called Anti-Man, and Anti-Man came to me actually as a series of essays that sought to position my poetry. My first collection of poetry, Taxidermist Cut, won the Four-Way Books Intro Prize to Poetry in 2014 while I was a PhD student at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And as I was doing that, a friend and mentor of mine, Rigoberto Gonzalez, the wonderful nonfiction writer and poet, was like, you need to contextualize your poetry for readers who are not familiar with your history. And so I started to write these essays that all circled a decade of my life. And so a friend of mine and I have a picture of her later, Anjali Roy, who's a teacher at Punahou right now, and who was actually in my cohort at the University of Hawaii, said to me, Rajiv, look, you've written a memoir. And I said, it couldn't possibly be. I'm a poet. I do not write prose. So she's like, well, how can you get your head around this? And I said, well, it'll have to clearly include poetry. And so I approached the idea of the memoir through thinking about the kinds of genres that I was familiar with. So, what that included for me was the writing of poetry, translation, transcription, speculative speculation, as well as narrative nonfiction prose. And I twisted all of these genres together to form my version of a hybrid memoir, a memoir whose genre is very much a hybrid thing. And so this is how it started. You see this, we are in a cafe at Coco Head Marina. This is Dr. Anjali Roy and me just recently. And this is where the idea for the memoir began. I did not expect for this memoir to actually be a book, as I said before. And I think I kind of wanted to have that point come across very clearly, that I approached the writing of Anti-Man very much as a genre trader, in that idea that, I wanted to push the possibility of my poems to include like paragraphs in a way that didn't move exactly like prose poetry, but rather into this new kind of thinking that I was inhabiting. So, another question that you asked, Roger, that I really love is, how did I research? How did I go about planning research and researching and writing this? Well, a lot of it came to me through learning the history of my family. I come from a family of people who survived indentured labor in the Caribbean after the British outlawed the international slave trade in 1834. They turned their greedy eyes to what they called the jewel of their crown, which was India. My family were agriculturalists. And because of the missionization that happened in South America, my parents were forced to abandon a lot of things. One of those cultural things that they had to abandon was their language. But I had to learn who my family was. I fell into this fever. And when I was 20, when my elder brother was getting married, and I sat with my grandmother for 3 days listening to her songs and stories, and I heard her sing this song. My grandmother sang this song for about 6 minutes. My grandmother, who was unlettered in any of her languages, which were Caribbean Hindustani, specifically Guyanese Bhojpuri, as well as Creolese, unable to read and write, but she had this vast knowledge inside of her. And I needed to know what she was saying. So I was led through through her music into the world of poetry that captivated me. And so, I wanted to also show you my ancestors' pictures of them, who I've been thinking through and thinking about in their relationship to education, colonization, as well as my own personal queerness, which is one of the major features of this book. And I'll say that part of that research was digging into these photos and asking myself these questions that maybe my family wasn't too excited for me to answer. The people that you saw previously, those are my father's parents and grandparents. These folks on my this hand side. Oh gosh, this is my my mom's parents. These are my mom's parents, and then you see in the clearer picture, those are my parents, my mother and my father. And so a major problem that I encountered while I wrote this was, how the bleep do I write my family? And here's a portrait that I took of my family as we are. You see that this photo was taken about the time where the memoir ends. And it led me into thinking of this question, not as something to be answered, but rather a kind of web of problematics to tread as I delved into how do I write these very particular relationships, especially when it comes to my relationship to my own family as somebody on the outside, because of queerness, because of my interest in learning a little bit about my family. And I think that I use this question, how do I write about my family, as something to drive my reading my writing even farther into answering it. So, you'll get no answers from me, only experimentations with this answer. And so that brings us to the final question that you asked as, what would I do differently? Man, if I could, I would do so much differently, but not necessarily with the writing. I think I would have probably, during the time of editing or, a little bit before that, before the book came out, I wish I would have returned to Varanasi in India. The last time I was there, it was in 2012. And I do miss this place. And this is the holy river Ganga. And this is in Tulsi Ghat. Tulsidas was a great poet of devotional literature in medieval India. And then here I am with hair. That's also something I would have done differently, probably done something to like preserve my hair. I used to have such beautiful long curls. And I think this part, the balding story, is going to come feature a little bit more prominently in the next memoir, should there be another memoir. Although a little bit of it is in Anti-Man. All right, and I think that's all I wrote. So thank you.
So you are already imagining at least another memoir.
Oh yeah, in a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way.
Because why tongue-in-cheek?
Oh well, I mean, I feel like I needed a good 15 years away from the story of Anti-Man to be able to have enough perspective to write it. You know, thinking through where I am now, how I'm positioned, how I'm going to position myself. I'm already kind of formulating what the next thing would look like, and it's going to be a little bit boring, unfortunately. You know, as I reached my 30s and 40s, the adventure kind of, you know, fizzled out a little bit, but hopefully bring it back.
Listening to you, I can't imagine it's going to be boring. Sure, Don will be chasing you shortly for a contribution to the Wire Review of Books, which lamentably you were apparently not aware of, but it's a wonderful enterprise. So even before he gets to you, look it up. Okay, next I have John Walters. John?
Well, thank you for that question. Oh, go ahead.
Well, tell us about yourself and how you came to write this memoir, and then how you lived it.
Well, growing up, I read a book called The Old Man and the Boy by Robert Rourke. If you're not familiar with it, it's I consider a really good book. And what he did was he wrote about his childhood and the things that meant a lot to him. And as I put in my book, we started to lose family members. We lost my brother, we lost my father. And we have you know, like everybody else, we have an oral tradition in our family. We sit around at holidays and we tell stories about the way we grew up and the things that we knew. And with them gone, I woke up one day and I just realized that if I didn't sit down and start to preserve these things, they would be gone, because nobody else really remembered them, or if they did, they never said anything about it. And I knew then, I guess, we lived a little differently on the Big Island. And I've talked to people, you know, for years, and people just probably will not believe the way it was back then, but that's really the way it was. So I didn't really start with a plan to write a memoir. I started with a plan to write stories that I could give to my daughter and maybe my granddaughter. And then it turned out that there were so many more stories than I thought I would remember. And then the other thing was that on this journey, because it really was a journey, not only did I write stories, but I kind of went back and I started to look at my life and the way that I lived and the way I grew up. And I had to ask myself, what did it all mean? Because it was something I hadn't thought about before in my life. I've just experienced it and went along. And as it turned out, at least in my life, it meant a lot more to me than I ever realized. And that place and that people that I grew up with meant a lot more to me than I ever realized growing up and just doing whatever I've done. So the outcome, actually, to be honest, was a lot better than I thought it would be. The outcome was actually what I would consider to be a story or a book, or at least a part of my life, that part of my life that I was writing about. So I was very, very pleased with the way that it turned out. I had no expectation it would be that good, at least in my mind. I didn't really plan it as so much as I wrote it. I wrote all the stories and everything that I could remember in little vignettes, and then I planned it. I took all of that, and actually, your next presenter, Gary, and I bought her book, and I read that, and it was invaluable because it helped me give it structure, because I had no structure before I did that. So then I had to kind of reverse plan it and look at it and say, how do I organize this so that it makes sense? And that's how I did that.
And
I
just
researched, go ahead.
go ahead.
The thing that I did to research it was because so much time had passed. Thank God for Google Maps. I was able to go back onto the Big Island and look at it from above. And I could, because of the detail, I could go down to Punaluu Beach and I could see the concrete piling that we used to jump off of. I could look at the trails that I walked when I was young. I could look at the spots that I dove for fish and everything everywhere. So that also kind of helped jog my memory and bring things back.
That's a fascinating detail. It had never occurred to me you could use Google Maps as a tool for writing a memoir. It's actually perfectly sensible. Just briefly give us a sense of what you, of the stories of of the life you led there, and what period does it cover?
Well, it covers from 1955 till I left Pahala in 1969. So it spans. Well, the early part is more being on the Big Island, because when I was 5, I lived in Hilo and Papaico and Pepekeo and those places. But those were just sort of, I guess, places on the way to Pahala. And then we went to Pahala in 1957, and I stayed there until I left the Big Island to go in the Navy. So that time frame, it goes all over the place, because it goes from being 5 years old to being 18 and all of a sudden graduating from high school and having everybody think of me as a grown-up, which was kind of surprising to me, because as you can tell from my book, I never really acted like a grown-up. I actually decided to publish it because of a couple of good friends that I was sending these stories to, and both of them, who I trust implicitly, said, "This is really just too good to just put away in a shelf or give to your daughter or your granddaughter. This is something that, this is a way of life that is gone. It's history, and however people look at it, whether it was colonialization, whether it was plantations, it was a way of life. It was a way of life that people like myself treasured, and I really am grateful that I was able to live there during that time, because it's gone."
Did you have an editor?
Yeah, actually I did. I went to a publishing, legacy public. Actually, I had an editor. I needed an editor. I went to Ka'u High School. I had commophobia. You know, commophobia means that I sprinkle my commas all over my pages, and wherever they fall, that's where they land. That's it. You know, that's as good as it gets. But I can still tell a story.
So how was working with an editor for you?
It really helped me a lot, because it didn't change the outcome or the story very much. But what they did really was they gave it polish, I guess you could say. They took out those things that, you know, I wrote that thing for years. I had a heart attack and I started writing it after I had my heart attack, because I didn't want to leave nothing behind. And what they did was they took what I wrote and they helped me put it in a form that I'm not ashamed of, and I'm not ashamed to leave behind when I go.
That's wonderful. Well, that's great. I think the pandemic has caused a huge surge in thinking like yours, and the ambition of actually writing a memoir like yours. And one of the reasons we put this program together today was to encourage people to do that, but to give them a context, how other people have done it, and even some practical advice. So thank you. I enjoyed your book, and also
one last thing though, Roger. One last thing. You know, I have to thank Gary, because one of the things I had to think about was the finish, and to explain to people what it all meant. And I didn't do that until I found out that that was something that I was lacking. And if anybody was going to do a memoir, I would suggest they do the same thing. Just at least in their own mind, say what it means, because it should mean something if you're going to do it.
Well said. Thank you. Sydney, I'm going to have you next.
Okay, aloha mai kako. Aloha Roger. Thank you, John. I feel so honored to be on this panel, and just really a heartfelt thank you to you, Roger, because my book is 10 years old this year. It came out in 2012, and I think you had me right on as soon as it came out on the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. And I've been presenting periodically throughout the last 10 years, but it really, it caused me to just sort of reflect when you asked me again this month to present, and it's a chance to just go back there and kind of see, like, what was I thinking and why did I do it and all of that. So as I'm starting to I just have 2 slides. As we were talking a little bit earlier, mine's a little bit complicated narrative, and I just got this question yesterday. Actually, I was on a podcast, like, how did it start? And it took me right back to the picnic table that I was sitting at the Hawaiian Studies department when I was a PhD student, not knowing what I was doing on campus. And I had no idea, like, why am I even here? And then 2 kupuna gentlemen we were at a paina or a party, and one of them looked at me and said, well, you could start with researching your last name. And for some reason, I listened to him, and I went straight to the archives and pulled up all kinds of stuff. And it was a little bit overwhelming, and I ended up writing it for my dissertation. So I thought I'd just share the cover again, because it's, for me, I just wanted to revisit it. There's so much information when I look at this cover. So the Queen and I, so I'm writing about Queen Lili'uokalani, and my kupuna is courtesy laukea, was her, he had all kinds of roles with her and with King Kalakaua. And so he wrote about his experiences as being part of the royal court with my great-great-grandmother, Charlotte Kaholo'ipua Iaukea, Hanks Iaukea. And so the Queen and I, that title was really The Queen and Him, because I use his memoirs that he wanted to be published before he died in 1940. And so when I went to the archives, I found boxes and boxes of Iaukea information that nobody knew about because they were in the basement of the archives, not for public review. So then I got this whoosh of information, and I found his written chapters that he wanted published, but the person that was helping him, something happened, so he ended up suing her to get the papers back. He died, and then my great aunt wrote his narrative in his early years, and then this book covers from the illegal overthrow up until around the early 1930s, and he passed in 1940 as he wrote them. So I put parts of his chapters in front of each chapter. So the Queen and I is the Queen and him, and then the Queen and I is the Queen and me, because I learned so much about them. And then the Queen and I is also the Queen and everybody that was affected by what happened in Hawaii in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it's a story of dispossessions and reconnections because of that it's dispossessions with the landscape. It's a reconnection to Aina. So it's that breaking of the historical narrative. And as Hawaiians, how do we then reconnect? And then the picture itself, this was taken in 1916. And so that's my kupuna in the white suit and the Queen leading her down the stairs of Iolani Palace on Flag Day. And it's John Aimoku Dominus, her husband's son, and his family behind. And in 1915, there was a bill of complaint to break her trust because she wanted to give some property to John Aimoku Dominus, who's walking behind her. And so they tried to break her trust, and then she passes away in 1917, and they settled the suit in 1918. and he doesn't get the property. And then you see all the flags, so the American flags, and then a presentation of the Hawaiian flag. So for me, this is what my book is about. And it's that complicated narrative where I'm drawn into the historical narrative. So it's a family history, but it's also like our own historical narrative here in Hawaii. And then this last slide, just to sort of pull it all together with my kupuna, and then the land that she granted him that was condemned by the territory of Hawaii. It's all of Date Street. It connects to my great-great-grandmother's land, so about 23 acres. Kaimuki High School was right next to that. So all of Date Street up into Kapahulu, what it looked like then, and why it was condemned was for the Alawai Canal. So my book goes into that. So I included this slide just to show, well, firstly, to like ground me back into the information that I found, because honestly, it's so complicated, and mostly because we don't learn this stuff in school here for the most part. So the territory, I feel like it's just sort of glanced over, but there were so many things that happened to the landscape that produced an American citizen, despite the illegalities of what happened here. And so these are just some of the things that I found, and I wrote about for the dissertation and then the book. And also, because I can't see it on my screen, but it says "e pa'aoko" means you hold on, was the direct message that the Queen told my kupuna to hold on to her trust deed. And so I sort of interpret that to like, for us to hold on to these narratives, and also to hold on to what we know is right. How do we go about standing up to the status quo that might not want some information coming out or all information? So when you ask that question, what would I do differently? Probably nothing, even though my book is a little bit emotional, because it has the emotions of what happens to the Queen, and it's heartbreaking when you read that information, especially as I was for the first time, when she's going through the suit to take away her lands, and they're trying to prove her insane, and she has to prove her sanity by saying, I'm showing up, I'm here, I'm not crazy, pretty much. Down to my own family history with land and the taking and the hiding and things that happened that I wasn't aware of before I started these projects. So there's a lot of that emotion in there. But as I was like looking back over it this past week, I was like, yeah, I would keep it, because it was pretty cathartic, and it was one way to get it out. And to also, because I'm a political science person, to emphasize that for Native peoples, or for people that have feel a connection to Aina or to their own land, emotion is okay. There is no way to like divorce yourself from all the legal things that I had listed. Like all of that entailed its own narrative around it. So I probably wouldn't do anything differently. And as far as like how much I shared about what happened and how it affected us and my own family personally. And then did I encounter personal problems, any particular problems? Only, and that was, thank you for that question. I think only my own like ability to present it, because I was finding out things that I had never heard of and that were controversial. So it was just the thought of, am I the one to actually do this? Do I have even the right to do this? And I talk a little bit about that in the book. And in the book, I say, yeah, heck yeah, I do. Not in those words, but it's like, yeah, why not? Like, why not have their narratives come out? And whether or not, if you agree or disagree, at least we have this multidimensional glance at what happened, and it explains who we are more today. And I think I got all your questions, unless you think of one that I didn't hit.
I have a question.
Yes.
You did this as a PhD. Is that a kind of a PhD that might not be possible in any other place except University of Hawaii? Because it is so personal. And the ambition of most historical works is to be as objective as possible and to keep yourself out of it.
Mhm.
But you did exactly the opposite. How has that been received professionally?
I haven't heard anything to the otherwise, and I think it mostly because it's become a tool for those dealing with dispossession or different indigenous groups as a way to sort of marry the academia with something else. And so for me, I was lucky enough to have a committee chair, Michael Shapiro, who he just was hands off and said, just go with it. And for the most part, it's legitimate because it's archival research. Like nobody can question the legitimacy because it's part of government documents. But it's also legitimate because it opens a space for our own narrative in the historical narrative. So like you said, a lot of places probably wouldn't have welcomed it. And at the time I realized that, but going back to my first story, when I didn't know why I was at the university, when I found his papers, then I knew exactly why I was there. So I sort of had this tunnel vision to get it done and then to get it published.
Has the book been set a precedent for that kind of narrative? Have other people followed in your footsteps?
Perhaps. I know of a couple personally that told me that they have. I'm not sure the larger scheme, but I know that it is used. For me, I'm happy that it's used not only in political science, but it's used in geography classes, it's used in Hawaiian studies classes, it's used throughout. So this cross-curricular sort of text. So for me, that's what makes me happy that other people can grasp it. And so it's not just a poli-sci thing. Even though, and I have to say, like, the dissertation and the book are two different things. I had to pretty much rewrite the book because it was so heavily steeped when I was a graduate student in the rhetoric of other political scientists that came before me, which is what we have to do. So I had more voice in the book itself. But yeah, I'm hopeful that it has opened it up.
Well, thank you very much, Sydney. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
Don, there you are.
Well, first, thank you, everybody. And I want to say thanks, Sydney. I loved your book, as you know. There's my copy.
Thank you.
I loved Vicky's book as well, as she knows. And, I will say to Sydney's book, I went to UC Santa Cruz. We would have done that PhD in a heartbeat in 1974. Come on. We were the history of consciousness program. And both as we lost our consciousness and regained it. But really the hybrid, which of course Antima and Rajiv's book as well, Vicky's is a hybrid because it's a biography memoir. And John's, I'm looking forward to reading it. But I just want to say you guys really represent, I think, the future of memoir, because we've all seen the big New York style of memoir. Like, I had a trauma, now I'm writing this big trauma, and now you're going to pay me a lot of money for it, and I'll perform it on Instagram and TikTok. You're writing stuff that is actually grounded in a historical reality or a personal, orientation, and it feels revolutionary compared to the commercial stuff that's coming out, and yet it's very readable, it's very good. And so I applaud you. And with that, so I wrote a book about France called The French House. And you're going, what does France have to do with Hawaii? Well, my wife, Mindy Pennybacker, a Korean, Caucasian growing up here, her family ran Hom's Kimchi. She fell in love with France and surfing when she was a kid. And I met her at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and we got married in a great scandal. And we took our wedding money and we ran away to France. I had never been. And not only that, I had a thing about France. I said that was for effete snobs. You know, I'm a man of the soil and the sea. And I'd come to Hawaii in 1969. Frankly, I thought Hawaii was a great place to end up. Well, what happened was Mindy and I ended up in New York City, very poor, living in a squat, an apartment that we were not legally entitled to. But we were putting a little money away because, of course, the rent was really low. And we had entry-level jobs. And we got a phone call from an old professor of hers in France, from a tiny island in Brittany where we'd spent the winter. And she said, would you like to buy the house next to mine? And of course, we had no money. So we said yes. And we did this. And that was 38 years ago. And it just about destroyed our life. At first, it turned out to be a ruin. We couldn't live in it for 7 years. And, you know, we didn't have any money. And we didn't have any money in New York. And we ended up having this crazy yo-yo life. We'd go to France to camp next to our ruin. So that was the vision of writing, how to write this story, which, believe me, is 100 miles and 180 degrees distant from a year in Provence, which is the French memoir everyone likes to talk about. My parents kept telling people we lived in Provence, you know, but we were in Brittany, which is a colder, harder place. And in honor of Halloween, I want to say Brittany is where Halloween comes from, guys. And coup, death, the Brez figure of the skeleton in a shroud with a scythe, riding a wagon, even trick-or-treating, all comes from Brittany and from those standing stones, which you know from Stonehenge. Brittany has probably 100,000 of them. In other words, probably 10,000 Stonehenges. And we have 2 stones about 10 feet tall outside of our village. And it gets spooky at Halloween. So when we do all that, when we think of how our lives take these improbable turns and we end up in weird places, and now you end up with alternate lives. Like we have a total life on this tiny island. It's smaller than any of the Hawaiian islands. Population maybe 2,500 in winter, but it has over tourism in the summer. And we helped introduce surfing. And you can read all this in the book, of course. So how did the vision work out? Well, if you only visit a place once a year, if you're lucky, for a couple of weeks to 2 months, it's really hard to form a continual narrative at first. And in fact, when I wrote my first 200 pages and my agent wanted to take it out and sell it, editors in New York just simply said, no, you're supposed to move to France and stay there and write about it. You know, you can't live in New York, Hawaii, and yo-yo back and forth to France. That's not a book. So I had to invent a formula that would cover that. And of course, it involved starting in the present tense, roughly about where I was at the time of writing the book, then moving back in time, then leaping to here and there with insulting memories throughout that were not chronological. And, you know, John, I appreciate what you went through because as we all know, memory is a rabbit hole. And when you go down the rabbit hole, there's no guarantee you're going to come back. And sometimes you just have to chop it off and save it for another day. And that's probably a piece of advice I would give for memoirists. Don't feel you have to write every flashback to the end. Start the flashback, stop, do something else, start another flashback, come back to the first flashback. Be creative because you're really just reeling off stories within stories within stories. And all you want to do is keep the reader going for about 280 pages. You know, form is overrated. Your form, actually, you work really, really hard on it, but no one will notice it because it's going to be sort of under the table, sub rosa. So how did I go about writing it? Well, it was pretty interesting. The 200 pages that I wrote for my agent, about 2011, she sent out to all these houses. She said it's going to sell in an instant, and it didn't. And she had made me change the order of the book. It started out with an old set of instructions that I gave to people, you know, how to find our house, which has no street number, no street. The village has a name, and that's it. how to get into the house and how to overcome your disappointment that it's a ruin, a complete wreck, that you said you wanted to visit, so now you're here, and introducing you to the people in the village. And she said, that can't be the opening chapter. That's come page 200. Well, it didn't sell. No one wanted it. So she hired actually an outside reader who read it blind and came back and said, boy, you should take that chapter on page 200 and put it at the start. So that was $1,400 well spent. I put it in the start and I was about to rewrite it and I got cancer. Got this really bad diagnosis. I went in for a biopsy and my whole body crashed. And I was in the ICU for 21 days. Sometimes I wasn't alive, for a few of those days. I was certainly not conscious. But the rest of the time, I had the laptop on my chest with my chin resting like this. And I was writing and editing. And it was great. I had nothing else to do. I never turned on the TV. So I restructured and rewrote. And then I sent it back to her. And she said, well, we can't send it back to the original big publishing houses. We only have these small indies. And I was very lucky, but an indie called Source Books bought it. And the amazing thing is Source Books in 2012 was an indie started by a French woman who'd gone to MIT, made a huge amount of money in computer manuals and started a publishing house. Today, Source Books is the 8th largest publisher in the United States. So that was how I got that far. Now the rewriting, once we got a contract, I had to finish the book. I had something called chemo brain. Chemotherapy, as strong as I got, basically riddles your brain. It's Swiss cheese. Fortunately, I had filled about a carton with little notebooks. And I had about 30 or 40 of them. And they were I'm not a diarist. They're just little jottings. And I reconstructed my mind and my memory in the process of writing a memoir, which I think is a neat trick. And it came out true, by the way. I wasn't making shit up, because I have to pass the test of my wife and have to pass the test of people in France, and but and that was it. I finished it. We turned it in. This indie couldn't get any of the major reviews, the New York Times or anyone to look at it. But as I mentioned, the publisher, Dominique Racat, had been at MIT and was a computer genius. And very early on, she tipped to the internet and she had figured out how to sell books on the internet, skipping the mainstream review organs. They got a great Kirkus review. And then in 6 weeks, it sold out. 6 weeks, it doesn't happen, unless you're, I don't know, Colleen Hoover. So from that point on, it's never been out of print. It's been 8 years. Audible just bought it. You can get it as an audiobook. I got a native Hawaiian guy to read the audiobook. He was one of those who auditioned, and he's very good, Kaipo Schwab. And, did I encounter problems? No. I would say, would I do anything differently? I wouldn't have worked in the oil fields as a teenager, which is when I got exposed to petrochemicals. And my final comment is basically memoir is great for all of us. It's the cheapest product to market because you're just mining your brain, or in Sydney's case, the archives in your family. We all have to mine our families. So it's potentially the most costly if you lose your family and your friends. And I think we have all been in that spot. I certainly have been held back and attacked on the side, and you have to be ready for it, and you have to be ready to be fair when you're doing it. Maybe hold out that juiciest story, only hint at it. And thank you very much. That's it.
Well, thank you, Don. I've actually just finished the book because I had originally assumed it was another, My Year in Provence. So I skipped it when it first came out. But knowing this was coming up, I decided to read it. I thought it's a wonderful book. And whoops. And what you don't say, because you probably shouldn't be you who says it, there's a lot of literary skill in the book. I mean, there's beautiful dialogue, which could have been disastrous, and you could have strained credulity. You know, one of the reactions people have to made up dialogue in memoirs, you know, that nobody can possibly remember that. Well, I didn't even think of that as an issue reading it. So that's a tribute to the writing. It's a great story, and I'm looking forward to the sequel.
I want to say thank you, Roger, and I'm so happy you read it by deadline. That's a professional for you. And you know, that's another thing. You know, he does the job, right? He doesn't just, you know, do the shallow thing. I will say one thing I did with the book, which is just, again, it's a decision maybe the other memoirists you'll appreciate. You know, I finished this book about France. I left the cancer out completely. There's no mention of it, even though it took me another 6 months to finish it, get it edited, and then publish it. And I haven't talked about it really until today in a public forum. And I think the reason I'm saying this is you don't have to make your trauma the center of your book, you know, even if in the case of many of us, it is our thing, but you don't have to like do the big obvious thing. Instead, the book is divided into 3 parts. And the last part is called Ankou, that spirit of Halloween, because the Grim Reaper comes and he takes all the old people in the village. He takes my father, my sister, and my mother, and the woman who sponsored us. And it becomes a kind of a litany of what you lose, like what John is talking about. And that was the main focus, was other people. What happened to all these other people? And I let my situation kind of put grief and tragedy, what we all face in life, I let that be part of the flavor, but you know, it's not the big cherry on top.
Now, did you make that decision without writing a word about it, or did you start writing about it, then decide, no, that's not a good idea?
You know, when I was at Queens and I was sitting in my little hospital bedroom in 2012, all alone after the biopsy, and I'm sitting there waiting for the result. And my wife, I said, I'm going to wait with you. But then she got a call from Haruki Murakami himself, right? And he says, hey, you wanted to interview me a year ago, but now I'm available. Can you come talk? And I said, it's Haruki Murakami, you got to go. So she left. So I'm sitting there all alone. I'm happy as a clam. I mean, they just take a little piece out for a biopsy. And the door opens and in comes a candy striper, trembling, and she's carrying a gift mug from Queens. And I looked at that and I said, oh shit, it's not good news. And she said, we just want to give you this coffee mug. And she runs out the door. I picked up my notebook and I started writing. And then I stopped and I said, I am not going to write a cancer memoir. And so I never did it, never did any of it.
Oh, well, I'm not sure I could have taken it as a reader. There's enough going on in that book.
Right.
Give anybody a heart attack. Anyway, thank you so much. We've got literally about 2 minutes left. I think the point of this session, as I said when we started, was to give a sense of how very different memoirs can be, what different shape they could take. And I can't imagine anyone didn't get that impression to these proceedings. I have one final pitch to make, which is we desperately want to be in person next year. It takes a huge amount of funding, and during the pandemic we were perceived as nice to have but not need to have, and all the funding that we used to rely on went appropriately to social services. So we're starting almost from scratch. So we have a fundraiser, which I hope will be very successful, on January the 26th. Attendees and you guys too, please put that in your calendar, and I'll be reminding you between now and then. And so again, thank you very much, all of you. I much enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, thanks everybody. Enjoyed it.
Okay, good to see you, Rajiv. This is
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Totally.
And I look forward to your book, John. I look forward to your book. You guys, you all
Yeah,
got to.
I got a question on the chat that I couldn't answer because I don't know how to do it. But
good.
my book has been published. It's on Amazon. It's called Hooligan Hearts, and it's on the Watermark website too. I'm sorry, I didn't know how to type. I typed it, but it wouldn't go anywhere. So I'm looking at it now.
Great title. Great title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. I heart hooligans.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, see you, Sydney, in the neighborhood.
Bye.
See you, Dawn.
Aloha.
Bye.
Bye. Aloha. I want to check my VRBO.